I am super excited for this conversation, and it's, I think, relevant at least for the first two talks that we had. So yeah, maybe as like quick introductions. Molly, obviously from Philaz, I think everyone is aware of who she is. Anna, founder of Vana, they did the spectacular Reddit DAO, and they've been working on basically like how do we create community-owned data sets. And then Ken from Bitmind, one of the OGs in the bittensor ecosystem. And I think relevant to a lot of our conversations, I think we're at this moment where in the Filecoin ecosystem, we've been talking about how do we incentivize like sub components of our ecosystems. And obviously, you both have battle scars. So maybe, yeah, to kick it off, I gave a one-liner intro, but yeah, do you guys want to give a quick intro, maybe go around the horn? Like, yeah, how, I mean, maybe Molly, you can talk about Phil Plus, but maybe so we can set the stage how we think about like incentives that are protocol directed and how what role they play in your respective ecosystems. Maybe Molly, I'll pass the ball to you first, and then you can, Anna.
Okay, cool. So yeah, maybe in the context of Filecoin land, John already mentioned the kind of Phil Plus protocol, which is our incentive in the Filecoin network, which turns useless capacity into a draw to fill that capacity with real data that can turn that into a valuable asset that we can sell to large scale entities that want to store their data archives. We even have some enterprises who are storing data. Has challenges as well, because now you need to avoid allocating data cap, which is our resource that is allocated through the Filecoin Plus program, to people who are not going to use it for useful storage, but are instead going to self-deal or try and game the system, thereby, allocating that scarce resource towards non-useful storage. And so the Filecoin Plus program has seen a lot of iteration, especially in the last 3 years or so, as it got kind of like more used and then needed to figure out how it evolved to avoid capture by parties that were trying to take advantage of those resources, and move towards more experimental, programmable on-chain ways of allocating that using things like FVM. And kind of another thing I'm thinking about as someone in the Filecoin ecosystem working on core protocol stuff, and I've talked to Anna about this a little bit, is around making sure that as we look at iterating on Filecoin incentive structures, that incentive goes towards not just the capacity accrual, which is kind of the historical thing that DePIN networks start out with, but goes towards things that are actually indicative of demand and adoption. And so making sure you're setting the right metrics that are driving utility and usage into the ecosystem. So one thing I'm pretty interested in is looking at how you all have used subnets and thought about incentivizing those subnets who are creating demand within your ecosystems, and all of the challenges that you run into in trying to set metrics or incentive systems for them that might then be gameable. So maybe that tees it up for you guys.
Yeah. So I guess the way we think about incentives is that you're basically trying to bring as much kind of valuable data onto the network as possible, right? And one of the things that's kind of hard about data is it's like one data point is very different from another data point. And there are a few different dimensions of that. So like if you're working within the same data set, like one person's Reddit data versus another person's Reddit data set, that has like different value. So we have kind of a standardized way of measuring that, which is called proof of contribution in Vana. And it's essentially mapping data, which is necessarily not fungible because my data is different from yours, to some kind of fungible score. But that's just within a given data set. And then you have this other problem, which is kind of across different data sets. So say you have someone's like compare their genetic data to their Tesla data to their Twitter data. It's actually like a very hard question to ask, like how much should those be worth relative to each other? And the way we solve this is kind of more of like a market dynamic question where we have these VRC20 like data set specific tokens that are paired to each of these data sets. And then we have kind of emissions that go to the top data DAOs that are kind of each focused on one of these different data sets. I think that it is always this like iterative process of how do you actually, what metrics do you use to decide like this data set is more valuable than another data set? If you're just using market cap, then like there's a ton of gaming that can go on there. If you're just using like data contributions, then like, for example, the car data DAO, which has like 8,000 drivers, but is actually selling a lot of data to like car battery companies, insurance companies, they have a much smaller data contributor number than a data DAO like Twitter, where they have, I think, on probably hundreds of thousands. I'm not sure what their metrics are these days, but many more users, but like at the individual level, kind of less valuable. We are increasingly trying to tie it to data access, which is just like, okay, how much does the data actually get used? And yeah, I can go into a little bit of that more. And maybe one other upgrade I'll mention that was related to the VRC20 upgrade, which kind of it's the transition is happening this quarter. So the emissions used to directly go to just like the data DAO treasuries. There are about 20 data DAOs. They're all focused on different things. There are several hundred on test, but I'd say like there are 20 very production ready data DAOs with like full-time teams behind them focused on like, how do I bring this data set in? How do I commercialize it? And I guess maybe like a few dynamics to just flag for folks in the ecosystem thinking about these things is like it can sometimes end up feeling a little bit zero sum. And so we were trying to find ways where people were getting super competitive and they were like, oh, like these guys are cheating, these guys are cheating, and you're sort of like, okay, like we all want to grow the pie here. And so one thing we did was like actually changing the size of the rewards pool to be proportional to like overall success metrics so that you can have this environment where like everybody feels like they win a little bit more. We also had a strict cap of only the top 16 data DAOs could earn, kind of qualify for emissions. And we actually got rid of that. And so now it's like, as long as you meet the minimum criteria, you can come in. And then the rewards also used to directly go into the treasuries of the data DAOs. And then they could essentially like distribute to however they wanted. They could give it to data contributors. They could help fund some of the team that's building it. And now we have basically this automatic buy mechanism that buys the data token. And the reason we thought that was important, yeah, you're muted by the way, Molly, but like this, so what we were seeing is people were kind of valuing the Vana emissions more than their own data token, right? And what we really wanted to focus people on is like, your data token is the core value accrual, right? Like the Vana emissions are here to kind of like support you and sort of help bootstrap things when maybe you don't have much demand early on. And so, yeah, but that we're rolling out kind of slowly throughout Q2. So the performance metric period is Q2, and then the automatic buy, and then it gets paired and put into a liquidity pool, goes into effect in Q3. Part of the reasoning for that too is that all of the data tokens had really low liquidity. And the issue there was that a lot of the people who are interested in kind of like data as an asset class are almost like larger players who can do research, like think like Web2 options trading firm who's like, how do I build an index of data tokens? And so if you have like $1,000 in the DEX pool, the answer to them is like, you honestly probably just can't right now, right? And so how do you actually build up enough liquidity that you have this like true financial market around data as this asset class? So yeah, that was like a whole bunch of kind of like the changes. If you don't have a lot of context too, like if some of that's confusing, yeah, I could go into more, but hopefully that at least brings some keywords that we can talk about more.
Yeah, that's great. And maybe before I pass the ball to Ken, just to clarify, so like in the Vana ecosystem, you said that the data tokens are the things that you guys want to like accrue value. Is there like a standardized mechanism for how data tokens connect to Vana, or is it more just like exercise to the data DAO subnet of like how those two are linked?
Yeah, good question. So basically what we want the data DAO tokens to do is be tied to the value of their underlying data set, right? And so that, I guess that, and so if you have a good data set, then we want your data token to reflect that. And we were finding that that wasn't really the case. In terms of how it works, so the VRC20 standard, I can actually potentially just link it here. It essentially lays out like, here are all the things that must be true about a VRC20 token. And the two big ones I would highlight is one, it goes to people who contribute their data based on proof of contribution. And that proof of contribution makes sure that it's actually verifying data. And then two, it's used for data access. So there are, I mean, a whole bunch of problems related to data markets. One of the big ones is the double spend problem. Like if I sell you my data, how do I know that you're not going to resell my data? So the way we kind of solve this within Vana is that when you access data, it's inside of a like trusted, secure environment, and you're just running specific operations on the data. So data access. So the second sort of core utility of a VRC20 token is that it's used to pay for data access, and you pay 80% in the data token, 20% in Vana. And so you're essentially able to have this like more flexible mechanism. And I think that's like probably something that at some point will become market based and is like a very crude, like, okay, we're first rolling this out, let's put this here. Actually, what's live on mainnet right now is you just pay in Vana, and then over time, I think it'll be like late Q2 when the data token payments will go into effect. But yeah, that's kind of how the mechanism works. I'll grab the link and drop it in here too. But
That's
otherwise, we've
awesome.
actually kept it pretty flexible. Initially, we actually were even more flexible about it, and then we started to see people, I guess, like there was one team, the Amazon data DAO, who's like brought a bunch of valuable Amazon data in. They built this like custom staking mechanism that was dependent on emissions in this way, and someone else built this other thing, and we were like, okay, like we probably should put down just some basics of like give it to data contributors and burn it when data is used. And we were hearing from the ecosystem too that people actually wanted stronger kind of statements about what the data token should be. We were hesitant initially because every data set is so different, right? Every data set, if say you have a data set that's really valuable in kind of a dynamic way, like you've got these streaming things, or maybe it's this historic data. So we didn't want to constrain the data DAOs in their design too much. But what we were finding too is that some of the great builders like don't have experience thinking about tokenomics, right? And it's like, and it's even more niche field is like data tokenomics, right? Like how do you design a data token? And so I would say we're not at all like fully solved of the problem. The problem's not fully solved, right? But it's like, okay, we've got this step, and then like we see what works, and then we sort of like have these best practices shared across the different data DAOs.
That's awesome. Yeah, I mean, I don't think anyone has fully solved these problems, so all the more useful for us to share knowledge. I mean, Ken, maybe do you want to give us an overview? I know BitTensor recently switched over to sort of like a new model with DTAO. So maybe if you want to give the version of like where things were quickly, but then also like what's the current experiment, how are things going, and I guess yeah, your sort of reflections.
100%. Yeah, I think with both File Plus and Vana, like what one fundamental aspect of incentive mechanisms is that you need to continually iterate and improve on it. Stagnation is death. But in BitTensor, I think the the incentive mechanism or overall consensus is called Yuma consensus, and it's meant to be very flexible. But what you were talking about was a recent upgrade from, I guess, how previously BitTensor was to what is called dynamic tau. So previously there was the network is broken down into different subnets, similar to different DLPs or data DAOs in Vana, but they're designed more around, I would say, work or AI workflows than data itself. And what this upgrade introduced was every one of these subnets got their own token. And so previously you were earning tau, right, for your work, whether it be you were creating models, validating the network, or designing the subnet yourself. And then now it's changed to you're earning this subnet token that is part of basically it's a derivative of tau. There's a Uniswap V1 pool set up for each of these subnets where both tau and that subnet token is injected on each block. And we're about 80 days in now, 75 days in. And it's definitely been like, a wild ride, and very, very interesting. But I think, what both Anna and Molly said is like the core of incentive mechanisms is really how do you quantitatively evaluate this work that is being done? And that's the really difficult thing about I would say incentive mechanisms on chain where you're trying to, algorithmically evaluate what is going on. And I think the most important design consideration you need to make in this case is how do you not get gamed, right? If there is incentive to Charlie Munger, show me an incentive, I'll show you the outcome. If there's any type of incentive, if there is money to be made, especially a significant amount of capital, there is going to be people that are trying to exploit it. So trying to make it as exploit free as possible, I think is your number one job when designing incentive mechanism. And I think Molly, you guys have like maybe a harder job than I do. I'm designing the incentive mechanism for a subnet itself, while both of you sound like you're designing an incentive mechanism for like a higher level system of different subparts to kind of create their own ecosystem around that. And I think something that is super interesting about this update is a lot of people are thinking about kind of what Anna was talking about, the demand-driven incentive. That is super difficult, right? I think, right, we've seen fraud and abuse case on Spotify, on different places where people pump their numbers and make it look like there's a ton of demand for what they're building. And it's almost like you really need to solve some of this identity problem before you can get into the demand-driven incentives. I think there's a bunch of interesting things you can do, but one of the most interesting design spaces right now of like what are the new incentive mechanisms? Because I still think mostly on bittensor, the evaluation frameworks for the incentive is about quality of this, usually an AI model's output. But like, hey, can we evaluate, in our case, it's about kind of computer vision deepfake detection. How well do you classify, is this AI generated? Is this real, or is this AI modified? And one of the reasons we liked it was such a simple problem to evaluate. But yeah, when you get into more complex incentive mechanisms or output that you're trying to evaluate, such as demand, it gets much more complicated.
I was
Maybe just
curious, and sorry, I
Mhm.
don't know if I'm allowed to jump in, JV, and ask a question, but I was curious, Ken, if you guys like had a little bit more backstory on like creating the multi-subnet token model. And it seems like both you and Anna have taken that approach of like make every subnet have its own token. And I was just curious, like, what were your learnings that caused you to take that trajectory? And maybe the same question that JV had asked Anna, which is there kind of like a value accrual step to Tau, even once you have subnet tokens that are kind of like the main thing that you're purchasing within each subnet?
Yeah, I can definitely go into that. So maybe I don't know, long-term history. There was actually only one subnet at one point. And like the kind of whole idea was to train this amazing model, and it would be great. And I think what they found out is that it needs to be you need to have a much more flexible system and really let community members innovate on specific problems, as opposed to trying to compete with OpenAI directly and build the largest model possible. And so I think that's what led to this kind of concept of subnets and allowing subnet owners to choose their design. What led to dynamic Tau of this kind of concept, every subnet having their own token, I think is actually much more of a practical design decision than it was like theoretical. It was almost like very human based. How it worked previously was that the largest 64 validators on the network essentially determined how valuable each subnet was. And as more and more subnets, they basically expanded the number of subnets that you could have, similar to what Anna's going through. She was like, we capped it at 16. People wanted more than 16. Okay, we're expanding it. And so the same thing happened. We were at 64, and it was like, the vision was eventually to get into thousands and infinite amounts of subnets. It was already a nightmare for those 64 different entities to try to evaluate consistently in real time, 60, at the time it was 60 different teams consistently updating, shipping, trying to improve what they were doing. And I think it led to some, maybe it was just very complicated and not tenable long term if you wanted to scale. So it was really, I think, it was a mechanism to address the scaling issue of getting to multiple subnets. But then on top of that, I think it was also about getting back to the core of bittensor, of open, free, permissionless markets, right? I think there was definitely complaints or criticisms of the ecosystem that, hey, these validators are, you kind of have to bend the knee and kiss the ring to these people. or else you're not going to be a successful participant in the network as a subnet owner. And it's a complicated one, right? You want people to make decisions that are very informed, have a lot of skin in the game, but you also don't want, right, kings to be made and uh, only a small amount of people to have influence over the network. But saying like the solution of open free market economics was just saying, hey, release all these tokens, let a Uniswap pool, which is how the value accrual is tied back to it. Basically, like every subnet's token is priced in a Uniswap pool, which has tau and their subnet token, and that's what's determining the price. So, yeah, letting the open free market determine, one, lets it scale, two, kind of goes back to the core principles of what bittensor really believed in. But that the value accrual is so interesting right now, and we're talking about it a lot. And I think is the next phase of bittensor. What is the value accrual of tau, right? I think similar with Anna, the vision is that all the value accrual happens to these subnet tokens who are producing the intelligence that is on bittensor. So then where does this leave tau? Is tau the medium of exchange? Is tau the underlying collateral that is just used as the value accrual mechanism for the token? We're 2 months in. It feels like it's been a year. I think we'll figure it out pretty soon, but it's been really fascinating to just watch the market so far, right? As tau goes up, I think the general market of alpha subnet tokens are all denominated in tau. So like if tau is really on like an uprise, the subnet tokens you'll see kind of like a systematic downtrend, but the US denominated value is actually like up or around the same. And then you see tau go down and actually like the price go up. So I think it's very early on, but I think really interesting and exciting trends are happening.
Yeah, it's funny. I feel like so I gave a very inarticulate version of this, but we should catch up after because I had some slides earlier that may be relevant, at least for like as you're thinking through some of those problems. I do think like this is a broader thing for crypto where I think for various reasons, I think teams have like sometimes underspecified these things. And it's challenging because almost all of these networks are like early days as well. And so when are you focusing on like grow the pie versus like revenue generation and like things like that? I think those are switches that also need to be flipped. And so I think almost everyone's in like growth mode right now. And so it's much less about like, hey, we need to be capturing fees in 1,000 different places, but having some answer to those questions as well. Um, I'd be curious maybe on for like both of you, one of the things that I guess it came up, I don't think either of you said it explicitly, though maybe Ken, you did a little bit more, was this idea of like moving from sort of like a humans in the loop version to a thing that is more programmatic and something that scales a little bit better. I guess I'd be curious for your respective communities, how is that transition moving over? I know this is like, I think we've talked about even in Phil Plus with like, how do we get to more automated notaries and things that allow for like programmatic distribution of things? I guess what was that transition period like? Were there any challenges you had to work through in your communities to like get people more bought in, or was that anyways directionally where people wanted to go? So those were smoother transitions overall.
Yeah, I actually think we went almost like too programmatic, too automatic, too early. Like we launched mainnet in December and we were like, emissions are on, fully programmatic, like let's go. And I think, I mean, then we had really short epoch cycles. So it was like 3-week epochs so that we could quickly iterate and kind of make improvements. And in the first epoch, rewards were just kind of distributed, or these emissions were distributed based on stake. And we were kind of relying on Vana token holders who choose to stake with a data DAO as them choosing high quality data DAOs. One thing we started to notice is that if you hold a lot of Vana, it is not necessarily the case that you're very good at evaluating what a good data DAO is. The more technical term for a data DAO on Vana is DLP, data liquidity pool. So yeah, DLP, data DAO, kind of interchangeable. And so we are seeing that often what was happening is people knew that they would get rewarded as a staker if their DLP that they staked with was in the top 16. So they should just stake with the safest DLP. So then we ended up seeing a ton of concentration at the top. Then as we introduced more performance metrics, so for example, like data contributors, how many unique wallets, we started to see people I think data DAOs, I guess, do the rationally incentive, like the thing that they're now being incentivized to do, which is potentially how do they get the most data contributors? Well, how do you count a data contributor? Can you make it easier for someone to be counted as a data contributor, even if they've contributed a bit less data? And so I think that it was like a little bit of this almost like whack-a-mole cat and mouse game of like every 3 weeks, okay, this is what's happening. And what we realized, and that was basically the whole first quarter. And it was rough for the team. Like it was like we were constantly just like shipping new smart contracts, new audits, just like literally on this 3 week cycle of almost like, I don't know if the equivalent is doing an airdrop every 3 weeks, but it was like really just like a whole bunch of tokens go out to a thing we're trying to incentivize every single 3 weeks. And it was also hard on the DLPs, right? Because we were changing the metrics every 3 weeks and then they optimize around it, right? They have their own teams and plan things to plan around. And so actually at the end of Q1, we switched to 3-month long epochs and kind of this whole like VRC20 upgrade, which is like outlined in VRC14 actually, but it's a lot easier to understand as VRC20 because it's similar to VRC20 tokens, data tokens. So I think that, yeah, if I could go back or if I could take learnings from that, I think it was actually relatively good just to like put it out there and have this like really quick iteration pace. And I think maybe what we could have done is like really very clearly set expectations that we're like, we know that this is not fully going to work and we are going to be very quickly iterating as with like any incentive system. And now I think that we have almost just like more information on like what makes a successful DLP or data DAO, how do those incentives work? And I think even the teams have had time to figure out like, this is what's needed to get a lot of contributors in. This is what's needed to help market their data set. It's sort of like there's almost this more maturity in the market that you can actually move towards. Okay, now there are data tokens and incentives go towards buying those and pairing them into a DEX pool. I think maybe one thing I would say is like liquidity on the debt. Like there are a bunch of things that you need to know in building in an ecosystem like this, right? There's a bunch on the economic side and there's a bunch on the computer science side, right? Like it's like, okay, you need to like build a way to evaluate data quality. Like the Amazon data DAO has built a bunch of like ZK proofs, right? Do a bunch of that. And then also think about like, how do you go to market with this? And then also think about like, how do you make sure there's liquidity on your, so there are just so many things. And so what we're trying to do right now is figure out, okay, like what are things we can take off of data DAO's plates and DLP's plates and kind of solve for the ecosystem so that you don't need like, I don't know, a dozen different skill sets that require like super deep expertise to be successful in building out one of these data DAOs.
Actually, one quick question, and I think this applies to both Ken and Anna. I think you both had mentioned that with DTAO and with VRC20s, you guys have sort of taken on the AMM's sort of like liquidity pool model. I'm curious that design decision versus just saying like you can take this token and burn it to get some share of a pot. So it's not like, because now you have like a liquidity depth issue as well of like if someone who has a lot of the data token just like cleans out the order book effectively, that can be like highly volatile versus just saying like, hey, you burn this and there's like a proportionate share. I don't know if there was any thought or consideration behind that, or if there's a specific reason to go for the LP model.
What would the burn model? Can you walk me through how the burn
Yeah.
model
So
just
imagine it's literally just like there's a contract that you put the money in, whatever, like Vana or Tau, and then to access some fraction of it, you just burn like your VRC20, and you get like if you have 1% of the supply, you get 1% of whatever's in that pool at that point in time. So then the difference is that you have like an equal. It's not like you have slippage. It's just like you get what share is there. There's an incentive to hold on to the token if you think long term like there's more and more Vana that's going to be more and more valuable in that backing pot. Yeah, that would be like the main difference. So it's more like rather than, and it's funny, I was talking to the Glyph guys about this because I think when they launched their token, they had set up a liquidity pool. I think like because they concentrated liquidity, then they had this issue of like in the airdrop, a lot of people just like moving through the order book. It's like in retrospect, maybe a better way of doing that would have been like have some pool. It's like if you have the airdrop, you can burn it for some proportional share of whatever's in there.
Yeah, I actually don't know how Uni V1 pools work. Is that like almost equivalent to how the V1 pools work?
So V2 is like, I don't know how V1
Because I thought that was like
V2 is
V1
literally
is
how
ancient.
yeah.
It is
Yeah,
yeah.
I think it's almost that, but I honestly have not looked at it in detail, so I'm not sure. But yeah,
You
I
can't
guess for
provide
yeah.
liquidity is the biggest difference. So
Mm.
like there's no way to provide concentrated liquidity anywhere. And basically like the pools start at 0 and 0. So like essentially as like a smart actor, it's almost like just restrictive where you can't move in size in any way, in any meaningful way at the beginning. And the liquidity is growing, but it's almost still like that. And I actually don't know if that was like, I actually don't think that was a
It could be good for this use case where like the goal necessarily isn't trading. It's like a more like specific,
it's
yeah,
value
like
accrual.
utilization
It's
thing.
to try to
Yeah,
build
yeah,
up like an ecosystem. Yeah, but I actually don't think it was like a strategic decision. I think it was like, hey, V1's actually the easiest to implement on the new
I see.
EV. I just think it was like a more of a velocity decision to like from my understanding. But like I mean, to that point, JV, like I really think with incentive mechanisms overall, simplicity is king. Because like Marta had asked in the channel, like, how do you evaluate the sort of soft contributions, etc. I feel like almost every airdrop has gone wrong trying to incentivize like code contribution and like all these different things, and they have like a giant README with everything that you can do, and then someone makes $1 million by uh, changing a bunch of README like lines back and forth all the time, right? And so it's like, super difficult. And I think my thesis and my evaluation of trying to build incentive mechanisms over the past year has been like try to keep it as simple and concise and scoped as possible. And one that reduces your attack vector, but it also allows to evaluate it in a maybe a much more meaningful way where you can get the output that you actually want. And by trying to, expand the breadth of everything, I think it becomes much more difficult. But
I think one thing on the UniV3 pool that I would just mention is like we do want kind of this like data-fi ecosystem of different financial products you can build on top of data, right? So like lending against data, or like having like there's someone working on a very early like data perps platform, right? Like leverage trade data. I don't know exactly what the use case for that is yet, but like it will emerge, right? Or like I think new insurance products that are built on top of data. So we do want kind of like solid liquidity in the market. But it does kind of take this trade-off where then it's a whole other problem space to think about, right? Where you have to worry about liquidity, you have to make sure that kind of like DLPs understand how liquidity works and stuff like that. And sometimes it's like a Web2 builder coming in who is just like, I don't even know what a token is. Like, what's a DEX? What's liquidity? And so we're trying to find the best ways to kind of make that more automatic, and we're working on some tooling around that too, so that you can just like have kind of like launchpad style thing that makes sure liquidity is there and stuff like that. But yeah, that is definitely a challenge.
No, 100%. And I know they want to, I believe that they're trying to upgrade Tao's like alpha liquidity pools to V3. It's just like it's much more flexible, right? There's more flexibility that you can do with it, but I think that has been a growing pain, right? I think prior, right, you talk about like the previous question was about automating kind of everything, and I think the subnets itself were relatively automated, but the evaluation of value of the subnets themselves from the root network was done by humans, and then this was this process to do so. But now it puts the economics of the whole thing on the subnet owner. And I think there's been definitely some growing pains there of like understanding what a liquidity pool is. Like, right, people were very focused on just like heads down building. Now I need to communicate to the market what I'm doing because I have this token. And it's definitely not everyone's skill set, but I think overall it's a good thing. The building in the open, being able to communicate effectively what you do is really, really important. And overall, I think it's been a net benefit on the ecosystem.
Yeah. Maybe I think we have 5 minutes left. I think we captured the questions that were in the chat. So maybe to end, I'd be curious if you guys have any like battle scar war stories of like what was the biggest unintended thing that you had to like fire drill over as you guys, yeah, have been building out your incentive systems and, or I mean, craziest attack vector that you've come across in your ecosystems?
I think
I
there's
think,
been a
oh yeah,
lot,
sorry, go ahead.
honestly. It's been wild. I think detail like so not only right, not only do you have to kind of think about the economics, but like your previous like right in BitTensor's case, you have miners um kind of earning rewards of your network that are just like extremely smart AI people. Like for us, it's like really smart computer vision people. And now they have to do complex financial economic modeling. And there's been like very large mistakes from extremely smart AI people that made large economic mistakes. And it can be wild, yeah. And everyone's all over the world. There's communication, language barriers, etc. I think, yeah, it's the early days where like people don't know how to, I think, how to evaluate and view it long term. Um, and so there's large spikes. It's highly volatile, but overall, I think it's a fun space to be in.
I think one thing I didn't realize was how much implicit knowledge our team had about data markets, where a lot of our team has like worked selling data before. Like the co-founder used to sell data. Like we had a bunch, like at least 3 people on our team used to just like sell data to big tech, right? And I think that implicitly we were like, people are just going to know that this is what you need to do to build a valuable data set. And to give an example, like there's a team that they have the kind of exports of shopping data. And there's like a retailer who is interested in that, but they really need the zip code level data, right? And so the difference between you including zip code level data or not is the difference between them being willing to buy it for like as much as the $100 million, like a huge amount of money, and them just being like, I can't use this for my use case. And so I think that like one thing, what we were in the mode of like, okay, let's bootstrap supply, right? That's how every network starts, bootstrap supply. But I think it's actually really important that as you do that, you're bootstrapping it in the right way and people have demand in mind where they're like, okay, this is like what I'm orienting towards. So I'm really making sure that the data is like going to be very useful for this case. So I think that would probably be, yeah, one of I mean, there were cases too that were more like competitive. Like there were 2 genetic data DAOs, there were a couple of Twitter ones, and there was kind of like this infighting that I would have preferred to have prevented in some way, where they were just like honestly both really great teams and maybe even could have worked together. And I think we, because of the top 16 slot, had kind of created a ton of like this feeling of competition. Yeah, so I guess those are some of the main things, just like the challenge in designing these economic incentives and how much context you need, both on the token side, but also on the, I guess, whatever is the demand driver. In our case, it's kind of like using the data, accessing the data. You need to understand both of those things to be able to design the economics. And then, yeah, kind of that competition and finding ways to have everybody really like working together towards a broader goal.